You are listening to the Fascia Guide, a podcast about the living body, about new research and a new perspective on health, pain and what it means to be alive. The Fascia Guide is a conversation between Hans Bohlin, innovator and fascia expert, Per Johansson, Doctor of Human Ecology and historians of science and ideas, and me, Axel Bohlin. So for the last couple of years, or the last 4 or 5 years, we've been holding lectures or fascia workshops in Sweden. And the interesting thing is that to these workshops, all kinds of people are coming. From the beginning, it was just therapists wanting to learn a new way to treat fascia, but then it was just people who were interested in understanding their own body. And then we've had doctors, we've had CEOs of companies, insurance. We have all different kinds of people coming to these lectures. A couple of weeks back, we had a lecture, and we always ask people, who are you? What are you working with? Why are you here? What are your expectations of this workshop? And she said that I am a people health strategist. And her friend was working in elderly care in a small municipality in the western part of Sweden. So I don't know if you have this title in your country where you're listening from, but her job was to look at how do we improve the health of the people living in this area, in this part of Sweden. In Sweden, we have a very, very developed welfare state, so there's a political mandate for persons to work with these kind of questions. And she described an issue that we have seen in other places as well, and it's something has happened in the last 10, 15 years, and a lot of institutions are kind of breaking down, like things are not working the way they worked before. The healthcare system is costing more money, people are not as healthy as they were before, the stress levels have increased as well in society.
But what was her issue? Why was she on the workshop?
She wanted to know if there was a way to, from a fascia perspective, answer or find solutions to increase health in her area of living. Right.
Mainly for the employees of the society, the community, or the commune, what do you call it?
Municipality.
Okay. And
the area.
The area, and secondly for all the people who's living there.
Yeah. So both people working in government over there, and also people who live there. Can we do something in this area to improve this well-being of the entire population, basically?
And I met a friend of mine who was his CEO or vice president of a big international accounting company, and they have just started a project in their, I think internationally, to see about sustainability about health, and because it's so important, if we have lots of pressure in the companies, and if you have a high performance company, you have lots of pressure, and they have seen that it's not so easy to have. How do you keep people well? The problem they had, both of them, it was they've been going to the traditional ways, going to the we call it the primary healthcare system, or to the company healthcare system, and they didn't got any good answers. How do you got sustainability or spread health within the company or the communion, or what do you call it? So I think that's an interesting way of why is it so hard to think about health, and how do we think about health or the body?
Because it's not about the knowledge and research and inventions and innovations available, because as we have discussed before, all this fascia research has shown up now, showing different ways to treat the body. There are studies showing, for example, that mental health issues can be really successfully dealt with by manual treatment. We went through that a couple of weeks back as well.
Or by vitamins or minerals.
Yeah, so nutrients can also help you in ways of dealing with health issues. So there are solutions in place that could be used, but for some reason it's hard to get them to fit in the current way of doing things. So there is a problem with how we are thinking about things and what ideas we are open from. Like it's kind of like the doors to the doors are quite closed instead of open. Like you're welcoming new ideas, but only a certain type of ideas. So it's hard to get in, right?
I think it's when I started with Professor Carl Arthur, he said that you're not at school, you not have the same way of thinking as we had, because my basic is a business economist. So, but in business economy we always, if you look at the whole company as a connective body, then you can see all the problems you have in a company, and that was the way I was trying to look at fascia from the beginning. At what can we learn about the wholeness of the body, and I think it's not a perspective, and the perspective is not easy to think about or to understand, and maybe it's the way we're thinking that's the problem.
Yeah, what struck me is that this has something to do again with separating ourselves from our own body, or looking at ourselves as an object, or looking at the world as something that's going on without us. Like if you look at separation, if you isolate me from the world, because we also had a growth seminar to look at how do you develop your business or your clinic to the next level? How many people will you employ? How many clinics will you start? How will you grow? And the thing we realized after a couple of hours is that people find it hard to think of themselves 3 years from now, like how much they will grow. They think that they will handle the same, they will be the same in 3 years' time, handling much bigger things, but they take their personal growth out of the picture. Mm-hmm. So for some reason we have, if you look at the problems that we have with increased stress or lifestyle issues or pollutions or whatever, we think that we will solve them by being exactly the same as we are today. So there's a problem here in our way of thinking, that we can't really think about the future in terms of how we will change. Because if you try to change the world in the future from how we are today, then it's a lot harder. But if we all change a way, if you change our way of thinking or being or acting, that will put us in a different position in the future to change things. So we have a problem. There's a way when we're looking at the future that's not really correct. And in the last episode we talked a lot about the 17th century and Descartes and how we were separated. We separated the body and the mind from each other. So, and there's something in our way of thinking, Per, that affects us thinking about the future or the past and the present. We're not really good at looking at time, or it's almost like we have put the development of the world outside of ourselves, like we're not part of the world, but we're still believing in the future. I don't know, it's something weird here going on.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it, one ingredient in the way we think, the separation of the inner world and the outer world, of subject and object and so on and so forth. But I think what the relevant issue here in relation to what you brought up has to do with one thing you said at the beginning here, Axel. One of the people you talked to said that things don't work as they should anymore. Things are kind of breaking up, and we've been used to for decades in doing things in a certain way as to healthcare and so on, it's tied to the development and of the whole health welfare system, really. So if we're in Sweden, and Sweden for a large part of the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, Sweden has been, and I think still is in some circles, a kind of paradigmatic welfare country. So Sweden is kind of at the very center of a certain extremely strong idea, which is I would say it's the quintessence of modernity. It's the idea of progress, that things should get better all the time. And there is a basis in reality for this idea, actually. If I put aside the philosophical background for a moment, I think it is important to note that during the 20th century, especially in countries like Sweden and other rich Western countries, different, each country going about it in its own way, but there's a general sense of material and economic progress. That's I don't think anyone would doubt that statement, and there's a real basis for it. If you study the earlier history, if you go back to say the 18th century and early 19th century in Sweden was really poor. And life wasn't easy for most people at all. So since then, thanks to technological developments, scientific developments, economic developments, and all these things work together. So since then, it's obvious that so much of material life conditions have improved. So and so that's one side of the picture, the actual observable, experienced betterment of certain things. This then has been tied to a certain ideology, a certain philosophy, which is a belief, really, a kind of myth almost, the belief in progress, that there's something, and this idea goes back to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, when certain French and other philosophers started to think about society in new ways, because especially during and after the French Revolution, people in Western Europe started to realize that society can change drastically. In a way, societies had always changed in one way or another, but this was a new kind of change, and it led to make a very complex history extremely short. It led to certain thinkers starting to adopt the idea that perhaps there's a kind of progression in societal development from a primitive stage via more and more advanced stages to the state of civilization. So there's a kind of progress from a primitive social state to a more and more advanced state. And so that's the philosophical idea of progress. And actually, people started to talk about social evolution, the evolution of societies from a primitive stage to a more and more advanced stage.
And it's actually, I remember, because I in university I read a course called Economic History, and we looked at the history of development of economics basically. And it's hard for us, I think, to realize how much things actually were changing in the 18th and 17th century, because there was a concept called the Malthusian Trap. And the Malthusian Trap was that a population could never grow to more than a certain number of people, because when you grew to a certain number, the resources were finite, so they would end. Like there wouldn't be enough food for everyone. So then a big part of the population would starve, and then it would go down again. and then there would be plenty of food for the ones being left, and then the population grew again, and then it was down again. So this model actually worked for many hundreds of years, but then something happened in the 17th, 18th century when you started doing agriculture in a different way. Because you started to, in Sweden we had something called the shift, where you started to grow things more effective in a sense, which meant that you can have bigger harvests. And when you can have bigger harvests,
an agricultural reform, very radical one.
And then Europe did the same thing. So we started growing growing things in a different way, which meant that we didn't have a food shortage in the same way, which meant that the population grew. Because if you look at the Earth's population, it's been rather constant, and then the boom started around the 17th, 18th century.
And that was actually, that agricultural reform was actually the start of the actual material progress. I hinted at earlier.
So if you have a change like that happening, then of course people will be thinking about things in a different way, right?
Yeah. So this is an important background to the idea of social evolution. People could see around them that things were changing in ways they weren't accustomed to. There was a new kind of change in the air and in the world actually. So this made plausible the idea that societies evolve from, as I said, from a primitive to more and more advanced stages, and this idea was then adopted by biologists as well, and led to the theory of the evolution in nature. So actually the idea of social evolution came before the idea of biological evolution in the history of ideas, and then these two. Actually, the biological idea of evolution since Darwin is very, very different from the idea of social evolution, but they still they became mixed up. But that's another story. Let's keep to the social evolution, the idea of progress, and it's also the basis of the idea of the welfare state. A welfare state, which on economic, technological, and scientific grounds is able to take care of people, so to speak, is viewed as being at a higher social stage than other kinds of societies where this is not the case. So in Sweden and other parts of the so-called Western world, we have experienced this for many decades. What's happening now is that the structures, the actual ways of doing things, and with them the certain patterns of thought, they seem to have, so to speak, have run their course. Everything that is possible to do in that vein has been done, and it has amounted to, if I really abbreviate this story very, very much again, it has amounted to another idea. It has culminated, perhaps I would say, in another idea, and that is the idea of control. Because one ingredient in this technological, economical progress has been an increased control over things that people in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century didn't really have much control over. So the idea of control has been essential to the fact of progress, material and economic progress. But now what we are experiencing now in our societies is an sense of increasing lack of control.
And it's interesting because
that's a kind of crisis phenomenon, or crisis a state of crisis, which means speaking of the future, because central to the idea of progress, social progress, is that you are completely fixated on the future, a certain idea of the future, and the idea of the future is that it should become better all the time. So when it doesn't become better all the time, there's something amiss, something wrong. But since we have become so used to the way of doing things, which are inspired by the idea of progress and social evolution, and tied to activities based in control, really. Now that this system seems to not work as it should in our minds anymore, we are at a loss how to handle this new situation.
But again, I think it's important to go back and realize that this way of thinking hasn't always been the way it is. If you look at what you've been talking now, and if you combine it with the Malthusian Trap and everything around that, so before this, everything was cycle. Like it was, you followed the year cycle, you followed the cycle of the harvest, you followed the cycle in a different way. So life was more the same. It was more fixed in a way. But then when progress started to enter the stage, people could suddenly, when you had more, you could, if your father was a farmer and your older brother was a farmer and you were the younger brother, maybe you didn't go to the become a abbot or something. You could also move to a city and develop another skill and then start work as a labor in that sense. And then the Industrial Revolution came, you can also move to the city. So there was a different, progress was not only society, progress was also personal. And with that, you could actually do social climbing as well. And let's say that you're doing social climbing. So you are a farmer, but then you start up a business and you start working with trade. And then you enter a different societal class. You're more of a citizen now than a farmer. And then status becomes important because you being a farmer doesn't benefit your social status, which means that you kind of want to eradicate your history, or you don't want to talk about history. And this goes very well with the idea of progress, because progress, you don't talk too much about history. So you kind of move history out of the picture in a sense, both personally and as a society. And
what you're describing now is actually something that started to happen long before the 17th, 18th centuries, but it increased. It has increased with the really important ingredient here, which we haven't mentioned yet, is industrialization. Which is kind of a continuing of the agricultural revolution. They go hand in hand. On top of the agricultural reforms, industrialization follows, because one and this is also tied to, if we get really material here, it's also tied to the building of railroad networks, because the increased harvests, if this is very obvious in the agriculturally rich regions in here in Sweden, if the harvests increase manifold, as they did in the 19th century in Sweden, you can, for example, the surplus of the harvests in Sweden in the early 19th centuries were so large that the farmers who had jumped on this bandwagon early became very rich, because they could sell grain to Europe. Not least, this was not a quite important part of the what kept the Napoleonic Wars going, because Sweden's the surplus in grain was sold to feed the armies. This is a simplification, but people became very rich, and then this required much more efficient kinds of transport. And so this is one background to the early railroads systems in Sweden. And at the same time, the industrialization process had started in England and rapidly spread to other parts of Europe, including Sweden. And Sweden was really good at adopting this new way of manufacturing. So and here also the railroad system became important to transport raw materials and goods in one direction, and raw materials in one direction and goods in another direction. So all of this hangs together and is the material experience background to the idea of progress, because it was such an extremely radical change in how society works, and the industrialization processes and the way factories work, the way factories were organized, the way logistics with the help of the railroad system was organized. All of this was extremely rational, became more and more rational, became more and more became possible to plan things years in advance. How things should work out by means of making all these processes more efficient, the organization of it all more and more rational. So it led to a really strong emphasis on rational thinking and economic efficiency. So this is part and parcel of the actual progress that was occurring, and it meant that the idea it seemed to make belief in progress, belief in the future, belief that the future would be better. A really good and plausible philosophical idea.
When I was studying to learn about teaching people, when I was studying to be a teacher, we were looking at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was quite amazing to see how they described the world, because when in the early 19th century we didn't have any passports in the world at all. You can immigrate wherever you want.
Oh, you mean the early 20th century?
Yeah. And the interesting thing to see, to study the as you have been doing, Per, is to study history and to see how it affects us. And one of the many, Professor Arfos that I had quite a collaboration with, he said that the thing that have the greatest effect on human health was actually an earth in England, Florence Nightingale, who said that you should be to be clean, to wash your hands and to be clean. It's important if you want to spread diseases. And she developed it in the Crim War to see how she could take care of the wounded soldiers to have them to survive more. And one of the biggest things in the late or the early 17th century or 1820 or forward, it was to clean up in Britain, because it was so when we have children working and the way of living was so poor, many people died. So one important thing was to clean up, to make it more clean and water supply better. So better water supply and cleaner hospitals and cleaner homes got better health. And the same as they did in the UK, we did in Sweden. I think in Sweden we had a guy who was working in early, I think from the 1930s and forward, he was looking at how dirty Sweden was.
Yeah, he wrote a book, Ludwig Nordström.
Ludwig Nordström. And and I think with the perspective of cleaning up society and cleaning up water and cleaning up hospitals and cleaning up people and being more clean, it's also important to see what kind of big things happen in the early 1900s, like Einstein and Bohr and the evolution of X-rays. You can see the body, you can see the skeleton system, and I think that's a big issue to see how do we look at the body. If you look at the body in a fascia way, you look at the whole body. The problem is the first invention we have was X-ray, and Madame Curie, she got the Nobel Prize. I think was it quite 19? I don't know, but it was quite early. And if you look at the X-ray, everything was going to be X-ray, because we had the Radium Institute in Sweden, and it was a big thing. It was the new area, but they didn't know that it was quite harmful with X-ray. And until they discovered that she actually died in cancer because she had too much of radiation exposure. So it's interesting to see how we can be so focused on things that we. So radiation was it was like the big thing, and many things I think were in the early 20th century. Most of things was so. Many things was so new, and it was like Buckminster Fuller said it. He was the one who was looking at bias and tensegrity and how the actually fascia was working. He said that if you look at everything that happened in the early 20th century with railways, aeroplanes, combustion engineers. That actually was he saw that it was so many things happened that we actually should see in another way. So his way of looking at it, that was like he did a new car in 1932, the Dymaximon. It was so strange that when he took it in New York, they shut off the whole town because he couldn't go in New York because it was so different. And you can but the thing, the way of thinking that you said that everything is progressing, isn't it the peak of it in the early 20th century? That was like hooked on us because of the way of looking at things with the X-ray and what's the way? Why didn't fascia go? Because fascia was mentioned in the early 20th century too by Still and by other people, but it was like it was forgotten or it wasn't looked at all.
But I think one thing, because I'm reading a book now about the late 18th century, early 19th century. So like when the first industrial revolution came to England in terms of making clothes. So when you replaced weavers with machines, and then you replaced the people taking care of the machines with other machines, and that change came, and it came very rapidly. It was just a matter of 20 or 30 years when employees were out of job or when the old job didn't exist anymore. So it was a rapid change coming. And there was also those who were opportunistic and found a way to go through that change, to change with the change. They were thriving, but the ones who were stuck were left. They were poor, or they were.
There was also quite in those early days. There was quite a lot of protests as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what this book is about. Like when the machine smashers and everything.
Yeah.
So
the Luddites.
Yeah. So there was a lot of change happening, and the thing when change is happening is that it's messy. Change is messy. It's because we have another thing. I don't know if you have played Red Dead Redemption games or heard of them, but they take place in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when you have this huge change that we talked about when the wilderness went away. When especially in the U.S., you had the civilization was growing to the west. The Wild West disappeared because you started to because the Wild West was wild. There was a lot of nature and small and bandits and cowboys and Indians, and it was all this that aspect of it. But then civilization grew, and with the wilderness became smaller and smaller and smaller, and people living in the wilderness became more and more eradicated as well. So it was a lot of change. But then you also had the change of new inventions, and then you had the snake oil salesman. So there was an epidemic of snake oil salesmen. So people who were I don't know if everyone knows that concept, but basically they cooked up some mumbo jumbo and they sold it as the miracle cure for everything, and people bought it because they had also these cases of people saying, hey, this also works and so on. So whenever things are changing, people adapting to the change or seeing the opportunity in those changes will also find ways to thrive in them. And the interesting thing was, I think we've talked about this in another discussion, but we can bring it back here. At the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century, the whole world of medicine was very unregulated. It was there had been so much change in such short time, and with all other things happening, that it was like the Wild West, but in medicine. So.
Yeah, that was it was definitely the case in medicine. It was generally the case in most areas, actually. And this takes us back to the importance of striving for control. Because in order for an industrial economy to work, you have to control all the basic ingredients in it as much as possible to increase efficiency and to be able to plan rationally how things should work. And this ties into also the idea of the health issues, which was brought up earlier, connected to people being dirty. People being dirty, getting sick is not good for. If you have a factory, you have to have. At the start, it didn't really matter if the workers were healthy or not. But the more established this system became, the workers became more and more important as a resource, and much of the conflicts between workers and capitalists in the early 20th century was because. On both sides, really, one realized that how shall I put it? The workers realized that they were a resource, and that was a possible base for power base in that realization. So they started to make demands, and the industrialists and capitalists found eventually that it was more efficient to say yes to at least some of these demands. If we bracket the whole question of revolutions and Russian Revolution and all that, and look at in Sweden is a rather interesting case, because here we didn't have a revolution in Sweden, but we had a kind of very, for a while, extremely efficient compromise between workers' interests and the capital interests, which is actually called the Swedish model, also in Sweden, the Svenska modellen, which is really basic to the Swedish welfare system. So what it amounted to was both sides of the power issue here, the workers and the industrialists, both sides acknowledged the importance of progress and making a better future. And this gave rise to a system where there was a general consensus that controlling certain aspects of life was a good thing. So the Social Democrat Party in Sweden, which was really the political party which built up the modern welfare state in Sweden for decades, they were avid, really enthusiastic believers in the idea of progress. And they shared this idea with the industrialists. So, and they had lots, as we already said, they had lots of things to show for it. The economic, material, technological progress was very remarkable. And this, up into this day, is so ingrained in especially Swedish consciousness, but also in other parts of the Western world. But I think we are extreme here in Sweden. But we are really, because of this history, quite unable to think of the future in any other way than as a continuation of the progress that we have experienced.
And a part of this is also
years.
because the education system was developed at the same time.
Yes, of course, and the education system was also developed in order to. It was part of the industrialization project, really, not only in Sweden but in the world generally. Industrialization and public and general education belong together, because as science and technology progresses, the demand for a better and better education also increases. So Sweden was very early as to general education, really.
But this idea, basically the industrial interests with the governmental interests, with the idea of progress and how society
and the people's interests as well.
And the people's interest in terms of the idea of progress and societal changes, like the society we want to build, the kind of the vision you're selling here. Like what the vision is, that we have a society that will progress, and if we just do these things in the name of progress, things will happen. And that's an idea that's been used in several cases, because I understand this is a history lesson, but it will come to the point why this is so important to understand, because it really has affected our way of thinking. Another example of this is the founding of the modern medicine, which is connected to the Flexner report, because if you look at the chaos with the snake oil salesmen, and then you have very advanced and skilled osteopaths and chiropractors and things like that who are doing things, and then you also have traditional medical doctors or healthcare practitioners, and then you have people who say they are these kind of things but are not these kind of things. So it's like the unregulation resulted in trust issues, resulted in people getting people going to professionals for help that weren't that professional, people buying snake oil basically. So there was a need for structuring this in a sense, especially from a political point of view.
Yes, and the people who took upon themselves to bring structure to this chaos were actually the leading capitalists of the day, the so-called oil barons, Carnegie and Rockefeller, who were at the height of their power as capitalists and industrialists and as oil barons. They were extremely unpopular, and there was a real crisis for them. How are we going to turn people's consciousness around so they don't view us as evil? So in order to change that they started various foundations which were aimed at increasing welfare and developed public development in various ways. And one area in which they spent a lot of money on to reform and make better was medicine. So this was a kind of a propaganda thing from the beginning. From their point of view, they wanted to make themselves look better in the public eye, and they, well, you could say they pulled it off. But the interesting thing in relation to medicine then was that an early project within this foundation context was that I think it was Carnegie who in 1908 gave a man called Abraham Flexner his
mission. His
mission.
Yeah.
Yes, mission was the word I was looking for. His mission was to make a kind of overview, an inventory of all the medical education medical kinds of education that existed in the USA and Canada at that time, and this he did, and he came to the conclusion in the so-called Flexner report that it was rather very chaotic. It wasn't rational. This will have to be organized more like other parts of society, like, not least the industrial kind of organization had shown itself by then to be very have showed itself to work really well in certain respects. So why not do the same with medicine? So this is a rather long and complex history as well, but quite early on it led to you could say that these rich families, by means of their foundation, made a pitch also to the government that if we can help you organize medicine in a more rational way, and to establish U.S. government will have, I guess, the government will have to establish recognized
but certificates of
for
titles
medicine.
or standardization, basically.
Yeah, you have to standardize the curriculum, and the way to standardize the basis for standardization of the curriculum would be natural science rather than all kinds of other perspectives. So this is an important part of the background why modern medical science since then has become more and more based on really biochemistry and in later on molecular biology. So,
but also a way of making money. The easiest way to make
money is because
much of the
pharmacological industry is based on drugs, of course.
Yeah.
And drugs are made, very large part of all the drugs we use are based on oil.
Mm.
So, and they were oil barons.
Yeah.
So they could do two things at once. They could become even richer, and they could contribute to the medical the development of medicine as we know it today.
And it would have been one thing if it was only that we had to standardize this and these drugs that we're using that we can find efficient and so on, they're working. But what they also did in the same era was they pushed out all other versions of medicine,
Natural.
like all natural medicine, because there are
that became in the States and Canada, and also very early on in Sweden, for example, the government decided that only one kind of perspective when it comes to medical education is legitimate. And that perspective was what has become the natural science perspective, which means that you have this, which we have discussed earlier, you have this division between the subject and object, and you have this partitioning of the body in parts. And the smallest parts are the most important ones nowadays then, since then really, the molecules.
But why is this an issue then? Because now we talked about this whole thing. What is it that's...
I think
Well,
when you explain...
Let me just say very, very briefly, the issue has to do with at this point in history where all these controlled ways of doing things, which are all because if you divide things into subject and object, then you have a perspective, which means that you can look at the so-called outer objective world in order to control it. And this is exactly what was done in this whole modern development with industrial production and so on. It was control of variables in the external environment. And in relation to medicine and the human body, if you view it as an assemblage of parts working together, then you can control various parts. And one way of controlling the parts of the body is by means of molecular interventions, you could call it. And as we have, I think we have touched upon this in earlier episodes, if you learn to think in that way, partitioning things in that way, in those ways, then you don't really learn how to think of the whole as a whole. The living body as a whole is not an issue from that perspective. So when in these days, then you're confronted with problems in healthcare, for instance, and medical care, which has to do with the necessity of starting to understand the living body as a whole, which is with fascia research contributes to the necessity, that insight, so to speak. Then everyone involved, basically, whether it's a politician, a scientist, or a doctor, or a nurse, or even a patient, everyone involved has been educated into a perspective which makes it impossible to think in terms of a whole living body. So all this rambling in this our talk here, or all these snapshots of a very complex history, what they amount to is what has happened in the world dominated by this Western history, is that it has very firmly established a certain way of viewing ourselves and the world. And it's, as I've said before, it's basically a matter of philosophy, but it's not just philosophy in the intellectual sense, something that occurs in your head. It's philosophy as practice. It's philosophy as something which actually exists in the world.
Yeah.
So the actual material economic progress, which we can see around us and see as a fruit of a certain historical development, this is a certain perspective, a certain paradigm, a certain philosophy realized in the external world. and that's the reason why it's so ingrained and so difficult to transcend.
One of the medical doctors I've been in contact for the last 10 years, I called him up when we had done the paper on frozen shoulder. The frozen shoulder it's a disease or a situation where you have lots of pain, but you have also not so much movement in the shoulder. And he called me because I called him up, and he answered that day, and he said, you can't understand how interesting that you called me now, because I'm now head of the pain center in Sweden. And the thing we have here is strange, because 50% of the people working here are psychiatrists, and the thing you have been showing us now is that pain actually is in the fascia. So it's in the body. But we didn't go, it was last full stop there, because the problem is to see the other way, to see the other picture. And I think when we started this 2015, when we was in Washington, I think we said it before that fascia is a global quest, is something that everybody needs to know, because that's the thing you're in. That's the body you're in for the moment. And the thing is, we haven't been taught in school about the body we're in.
That's what you're saying now is extremely important in relation to the perspective which I have painted here. This whole modern history, this whole history of industrialization and making things more efficient, and this whole history of understanding life and the body and the ways of doing medicine and all of this is literally, this seemingly external development is literally internalized in everybody living in these societies. So we literally experience in our own bodies every day the consequences of this
separation.
You could say philosophical environment, which isn't just philosophical anymore.
And if you look at change, because we talked about change in the 17th century with the 30-year-old War and Descartes and the scientific revolution and everything around that. And we talked about change in the 17th century with the Malthusian Trap and the way of doing agriculture and the way of thinking and so on. We talked about the change in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution and beginning of that, then change in the 19th century and change in the 20th century. So there have been profound moments of change. But the interesting thing with those times, apart from our times, is that now we have built up such an extended external world based on this one idea, or this ideas that we've had, that makes it hard for us to even think in a different way, because everything around us speaks to one way of looking at things. So change is, we are not, it's hard for us to think about things in a new way, which is needed for change. We find it hard to think about things in a flexible way, and we find it hard to even look at our own way of looking at things, because we're not trained to look at how we are looking at things. Because if you take, for example, the idea of progress and the idea of the future and so on, that doesn't have anything to do with the body in a sense, because the body is never in the future. But we as a society always think of everything that is good and going to happen in the future. So that even when
means that if you're thinking about the future all the time, your body isn't there. So
it's alone.
It's an out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
No, but if you think of it, there are so many people on vacation looking at their phones about things happening somewhere else, or there are people looking at their phones about things happening somewhere else, or you're working and you're thinking of your trip, and then you're on your trip and you're thinking of coming home. So we find it hard to be in the present because we're trained to always think of things in the future. And in the same way, we don't think about history, because we have kind of we have learned that history is quite a boring subject in school, That's like the main. If you look at, if you have ask all people who went to school, what do you think of the subject of history? I dare you to say that not more than 10 or 5% think that history was interesting. But that was at least my experience when looking around at kids in school. They were, oh no, history again. I was like, yes, history, that's fun. So we kind of think of history in the same way. So we're not in the present, and we don't think about history, and all our fate is in the future. But now the future doesn't look like it did before, because the future has changed.
What it used to be.
The future is not what it used to be. The future has changed, and we don't have the way of thinking to adapt to that change, because the idea of control and how much control has built up in society kind of
what we're
prohibits
seeing
change.
now in the world, I think, is the continuation of this progressive development and way of thinking, because you could say that the essence of the modern history, all of this material and economic progress, the essence is that it is based on increased control of various issues involved in these developments. So the almost automatic reaction to things when it is more and more experienced that the future isn't what it used to be, what is the almost automatic response in order to make, because the belief in the future hasn't ceased. So what the automatic response is to increase control, because that's the way we're used to handling things.
And as Gimberto says, he was filming Living Fascia. Fascia is a system everywhere from the beginning, it's our whole universe. And the thing is, it's
chaos.
It's chaos.
It's organized chaos.
It's only and nothing is in control, but it is in control. So that's interesting to see living tissue and living fascia. Is that,
or if you look at the living flow, because if you look at the living body and you look at the flow can't be controlled.
No.
So the life can't be controlled. Nature can't be controlled, but we're trying, and that's interesting. Why are we trying to control it so much? And I think that's the idea of control could be something that's in the way for us to actually understand the body and life and fascia.
Well, I think it's a basic issue, both in regard to what's happening in society and the external world, in our relationship to the greater external world, and it also the central issue in regard to ourselves and how we view ourselves. We are much too trying to control ourselves in various ways. Like we're trying to control society, we're trying to control nature, we're trying to control ourselves in the belief that this is how progress is possible.
So we should probably just let it go and be in the flow.
Well, we have to learn to think. The challenge is to not to so to say lose control, but the challenge is to how to think in terms which makes it possible for us to adapt to the actual flow of things.